Hi guys, this is day 9 of the 42-day revision challenge, and today we are going to do what we call consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is basically the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. Sometimes what happens is that what you're willing to pay is much more than what you actually pay. Let's say I go and buy a shirt and the market price of that shirt was, let's say, $5. So the market price is, let's say, $5. But let's say I like the shirt a lot and I'm willing to pay much more. And let's say what I'm willing to pay is like $8. So this means that there is some welfare gain I'm having. The welfare gain is the $3 that I'm gaining because what I'm willing to pay is more than what I actually end up paying. That welfare gain is what we call consumer surplus. How does consumer surplus come about? For that, we need to make a downward sloping demand curve. So when you make a downward sloping demand curve, let's make one. This is my price. This is my, let's say, quantity, and let's say this is the demand curve of an individual consumer. Let's say this is my demand curve for shirts, and let's say right now the market price is, for example, $5, and I am basically planning to buy at this price. Let's say I'm planning to buy 5 shirts. What is important to see is this, that a demand curve shows us what we are willing and able to pay, while market price is telling us what we actually pay. Does that make sense? So what we actually pay is $5. So for each unit, let's say I bought 5, but let's say for each unit, let's say unit 1, unit sort of 2, unit 3, and unit 4, you can see this. I'm willing to pay much more because all these points, this point A, this point B, C, and D, let's call it D, all of these points, and even E, all of these points are telling me what I'm willing and able to pay. But what is important to see is just that at point A, I am willing to pay, for example, 9, but what I actually pay is the market price, which is 5. Similarly, at B, I'm willing to pay 8, but what I actually pay is the market price 5. And similarly, we can do this 7 and 6. So for all units except for the last unit bought, I am willing to pay much more than the market price. Do I pay that much more price? And the answer is no. I only pay the market price. So for the first unit, I am pocketing this much of what we call the consumer surplus, which is the difference between what we are willing to pay and what we actually pay. For the second unit, I'm pocketing this much, and therefore this gap is shrinking, but I am pocketing for each unit what I say consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is what we say is the difference between amounts consumers are willing to pay minus amount they actually pay. And that is why, if you look at this guy's consumer surplus, if this is my consumer surplus will be, for the first unit will be 9 minus 5, which is going to be 4, plus for the second unit is going to be 8 minus 5, that is going to be 3, and the third unit it will be 2, because that's 7 minus 5, and then the fourth unit will be 1, and the last one will be 0. So if I add all this, which is the difference between what I'm willing to pay and actually pay, my consumer surplus, as can be seen from the diagram, will be 4 plus 3 plus 3, which means 10. So consumer surplus is the difference between what I'm willing to pay versus what I actually pay. From the diagram, for example, let's call this to be O, let's call this to be X, let's call this to be E, this point to be E, and then Q. So what is my amount that I'm willing to pay? So amount willing to pay if I look at this, amount willing to pay is all the area under the demand curve. So I will say that is O X E Q. But what is the amount that I'm actually paying? Amount actually paid. And the answer is amount actually paid would be O P E Q, because that's price times quantity. It's price times quantity. Let me write this P times Q, or O P E Q. So what is my consumer surplus? My consumer surplus will now be O X E Q, what I'm willing to pay, minus O P E Q, which would mean my consumer surplus will be actually this area PXE, this area PXE, which is area under the demand curve, but above the market price. So this is exactly what consumer surplus will be. Let me shade this region. Consumer surplus for us, therefore, is all this area under the demand curve above the market price. And it happens because what we are willing to pay is much more than what we actually pay. We also call this to be our surplus, to be our welfare, because that's what people gain from consuming goods or service. So whenever what they're willing to pay is more than what they actually pay, they end up pocketing this economic welfare that comes from purchasing that good. The larger this area, basically, the larger will we say that your welfare will be. And let's talk about basically what are the factors that can make or that can change this consumer surplus, can result in this consumer surplus to go up or go down. There are two factors that can affect consumer surplus. One is price, and another one is what we call elasticity of demand. So let's discuss each. Elasticity of demand. When it comes to price, what we say is this, that the lower the price, keeping everything else constant, higher will be the consumer surplus. And I want to show you this through a diagram. So let's say this is my demand curve, and right now the price is $10, and let's say quantity is 15. So the consumer surplus will be, I can say, will be A, B, B naught. It's that area under the demand curve over the market price, right? But what if the price goes down now? For some reason, let's say market price goes down to P1. Now, and let's say I buy Q1 quantity, now I can say this, that the new consumer surplus will be, let's say, ACP1. This triangle will be ACP1, which means consumer surplus will go up by this region. So the rise of consumer surplus, let's say the quantity goes to, price goes to 8 and the quantity goes to, let's say, 20. So the rising consumer surplus will be this trapezium, changing consumer surplus or rising consumer surplus will be this trapezium P naught B C P1. So this will what we call that when the price goes down, the lower the price, the higher will be the consumer surplus, because there will be higher area under the demand curve, and therefore what you are willing to pay hasn't changed, but what you actually pay has gone down. If I want to find the area of trapezium here, because sometimes it comes in MCQs, they ask us what is the area of trapezium or what is the change in consumer surplus. So I can say change in consumer surplus will be half times the area of trapezium. Formula is basically sum of this length plus this length, which is basically 15 plus 20, 15 plus 20. Times the height, which is 2. So this 2 and 2 gets cancelled. 15 plus 20 is basically 35. So changing consumer surplus will be $35. The second factor that we say affects our consumer surplus, so number 2, is price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand is telling us what we are willing to pay. The price tells us what we actually pay, but price last demand tells us what we're willing to pay. If our willingness to pay goes up, so higher the willingness to pay, let me write this, higher the willingness to pay, lower will be the PED, and therefore higher will be the consumer surplus. Let's see this through an example. Let's say in right now we have eyeglasses, and before eyeglasses, before the lenses were discovered, there were not many options for people who had weak eyesight. They had to only wear eyeglasses. So we can argue this, that the demand will be very inelastic before lenses, but after lenses demand will be elastic because there are more substitutes available. So let's make before glasses, before lenses, eyeglasses had a demand curve which was inelastic, right? And after lenses, the demand is very elastic. Okay, so let's zoom this on this diagram. And so this is D naught before sort of lenses, and this is D1 after lenses, and this is demand for eyeglasses. So let's say the price still is P naught. So we are saying this, that the more elastic the demand, the lower the consumer surplus. So let me call this area A and B. So what's the consumer surplus when the price is P naught and the demand is D naught? And the answer is that when the demand is D naught, which is inelastic demand, consumer surplus will be all this area under the demand curve above P naught, which is going to be, so consumer surplus when demand is D naught will be A plus B. And this is basically when the demand is inelastic. But when the demand becomes elastic, consumer surplus will be for D1 B only. So what we can say here is this, that when your demand is inelastic, consumer surplus will be higher, like A plus B. Why? Because we're willing to pay much more. This is the case when there were no contact lenses. A lot of people who were wearing glasses do not have any options. They were willing to pay much more. But when the contact lenses came about, demand became elastic. People were willing to pay much less. So for the same price, consumer surplus went down to area P only. So lower the elasticity, higher will be the consumer surplus, and vice versa. Higher the elasticity, lower will be the consumer surplus. Just like consumer surplus, producer surplus is a measure of producer welfare. It is measured as the difference between what producers are willing and able to supply a good for and the price that they actually receive. So when we look at a supply curve that is upward sloping, like this one, supply curve tells us what we are willing and able to supply for each and every price. So when you look at the supply curve, that is telling us your willingness and ability to supply. Now let's say the market price is, for example, $10, okay, and let's say the quantity that is being sold is 5. So for this producer, if the market price is $10 but the quantity that he's selling is 5, except for the 5th unit, the last unit sold, for each other unit, let's say the first unit, the second, the third, the fourth, all of these first sort of 4 units, what he's willing to supply the good for, which is this point and this point and so on, let's call these points to be A, B, C and D. All of these points are lower than the market price. So he is pocketing for all units before the last unit, he's pocketing something which is what we call the difference between what the producers are getting, which is the market price, and what they're willing to supply the good for. So for us, these vertical sort of distances or gap between the market price and what they're willing to supply is what we call producer surplus. So let me write the definition for it. Producer surplus is the difference between what producers are willing to supply a good and the price they actually receive. So producer surplus is the area under the market price above the supply curve. Just like consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve above the market price, producer surplus is the area under the market price above the supply curve. And we call this producer's welfare. So if I bring both the consumer surplus and producer surplus together and we look at the market equilibrium, and let's draw the diagram for demand and supply. So if this is our demand and supply, area under the demand curve above the market price, P naught, will be my consumer surplus. So my consumer surplus will be this region, while my producer surplus will be area under the market price above the supply curve. And this consumer surplus plus producer surplus gives us what we call our society's welfare. So if they're consumers and producers in the society, this is our society's welfare, where consumers will be happy because the consumer surplus tells us their welfare, while producer surplus is producer's welfare.